So sorry, if everybody can please put their name on, we can't, otherwise we can't tell who is who. There is one lady who's here, no name, and it gets confusing for us if you're a panelist or not. I'm not sure why.
Okay, you have my name, the Honourable Kristen Saint-Pierre. Do you see Kristen Saint-Pierre? Or just Honourable? Maybe you can cut Honourable and just put Kristen Saint-Pierre.
Yeah,
if you don't see my own name.
Yeah, that's you're fine. You're identifiable. There was somebody
okay.
Just Kiki. Thank you. That really helps us.
Okay. I think Riitta doesn't have her name. Oh, there.
Yeah.
That's Riitta. Yeah.
Okay. So we've got attendees joining the room. We're going to be getting started very soon. We'll still wait just a couple of minutes as people are coming in, and I'm going to take a couple of minutes just to do some lineup. And then very soon, Dr. Yael Danieli will get things started, but I think we can wait just a few more minutes before to allow a few more people to come in and for our panelists to get comfortable. Daniela, were you able to set it so that people don't, if the video is not showing, they don't show up?
Not yet. I'm working on the interpreters still.
Okay. So is that something I can do?
Yeah, I think it's something I can do.
Karen, do you hear me?
Yes, I can, Yael.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And do you see me okay? I don't think I
said. Yep, we see you well.
Thank you.
Sadly for this, we don't have a curtain to pull back, lights to flash or dim, or a drum roll. So when we get to the beginning, we'll try to create a little bit of excitement. I think there's one of you. Are you able to? I'm sorry, I don't recognize you. I'm not that good. Add your name. I think I just asked somebody to unmute themselves. Somebody can see that. Can you add your name? Can you add in the 3 dots? I think you can rename yourself. Thank you, Yuta. Yeah, wonderful. It really helps for us to see your name. Otherwise, we're not always familiar with everybody. Mercedes, I think you're not translating this morning, correct? I think you're not.
I was in for panel 2. I think I was substituting somebody.
Okay, so I'm going to, for this panel, I'm going to change your role to attendee as you're not translating. Thank you.
Okay.
Karen, somebody will have to translate the recording for the 3rd panel from Spanish to the rest of the languages.
Okay, so that's panel 3, Spanish, any Spanish interpreters?
That was Victor, remember?
Okay, got it. So,
he's the only one who submitted it in Spanish,
okay,
despite instructions.
Okay, so I think we're starting to get ready, reaching a point where we should begin fairly soon. Maybe just a couple more minutes and then I'll do a brief introduction.
What kind of introduction are you going to do?
Just to say we will begin.
Well,
and then
how do I lower here? Good. You still see me, right? I lowered it to be able to read.
yes.
Thank you.
Okay. So as we are about to begin, and so I think all of the tech team and the interpreters, we will stop our videos, and then we will allow Dr. Yael Danieli, who's the chair of the working group and the convener of this program, to get ourselves started. We have participants, we have attendees, and we're delighted and honored to be here. So Dr. Yael Danieli, I will hand this off to you. The floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all summit participants and attendees around the world. We have in our program people from nearly 50 countries, from all continents, all alarmed at the drastic rise of domestic family violence during the COVID-19 era, driven, as it has always done, by abuse of power and neglect. I'm Dr. Danieli, convener and chair of the working group on domestic family violence during the COVID-19 era of the United Nations Headquarters New York Alliance on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. Everything about this summit has been a voluntary labor of love. You can familiarize yourself with the illustrious members of the working group, our amazing technical team, and superb interpreters at our website. I'm deeply grateful for each one for generously contributing their unique best to help make this summit a reality. All of us are humbled by the genuine, courageous humanity of the individuals who shared their own voices and the excellence of the moderators and speakers. This summit is about people, us, women, older persons, persons discriminated against because of their sexual orientation and gender identity, persons with disability and or chronic illness, children and youth, refugees, migrants, and people living in poverty who can barely socially distance, all living together in our individual, family, institutional, and collective home, all under multiple existential threats, stumbling to escape and defend against a killer, invisible common enemy. As the incidence of COVID-19 has surged throughout the world, and as it is resurging now, almost all countries have imposed lockdown measures as the primary protection against the virus. Strict sheltering in place practices, however, also mean that the most vulnerable are more defenseless than ever. Unable to flee or seek help, they are cut off from their usual sources of support. They cannot alert family members, friends, neighbors, schools, places of worship, or other community resources. Indeed, reports of a significant rise in the numbers of individuals exposed to domestic family violence during the COVID-19 era around the world have mushroomed chillingly. The situation of vulnerable groups is so grave that some have named the mental health consequences of the pandemic-related measures and domestic family violence the second and third pandemics. The summit will provide platform for victim survivors of domestic family violence to share their experiences and concerns. Many provided pre-recorded what we call voices in the program to begin and end the various panels of our programs with individual voices. Experts to present comparative worldwide findings, program leaders and caregivers to share best practices in responding to, treating, and preventing domestic family violence, and governments and policymakers to share effective policies. A key goal of the summit is to re-energize the commitment of all stakeholders, including individuals, families, community institutions such as faith-based, educational, media, cultural, and other organizations, and governments on local, national, regional, and international level for a world free of domestic, family, and all other forms of violence. I am comforted and feel privileged by the recognition given to the seriousness of the summit by, for now, today, two world leaders. First, His Holiness Pope Francis. His Holiness Pope Francis sends greetings to the participants in the International Summit on Domestic Family Violence in the era of COVID-19, to be held virtually on 18-20 November next. I got it earlier, as you might imagine. He is confident that the summit will call much needed attention to the harm done, especially to women and children, by the scourge of domestic violence, which the present health crisis has only accentuated. He likewise trusts that its deliberations will assist communities on the local and international level to address the public health and human rights dimension of this issue through practical measures aimed at preventing domestic violence and offering its victims healing and new hope. The United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, graced us with his message as well. He wrote, "I send my warmest greetings to this international virtual summit on domestic family violence during the COVID-19 era. As the COVID-19 pandemic spread across the world in the first months of this year, it quickly became clear that both the crisis and measures to mitigate it spread were accompanied by a second crisis, a rise in domestic violence, particularly against women and girls. I therefore made a global appeal for an end to all forms of violence, from war zones to people's homes, to allow us to face this pandemic in solidarity. More than 140 governments responded positively to this call, together with civil society organizations from all corners of the world. But violence against women and girls, from child marriage to sexual violence, from online exploitation to violence in the home, has continued unabated. I thank the organizers of today's event for bringing together governments, civil societies, the United Nations, and religious leaders to focus our collective efforts and attention on concrete measures to end the scourge and rebuild from this crisis stronger, more equal, peaceful, and just societies. I send you my best wishes for your deliberations. Now, with profound gratitude, I formally open the International Summit, this is me speaking, on domestic family violence during the COVID-19 era by introducing the moderator of Panel 1, Women, Kristen Timothy, United Nations Coordinator of the Beijing 4th World Conference on Women. Kristen, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yael. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to welcome all of the participants to this important event. Violence against women is a pandemic in itself and has been for many years, but the COVID-19 has exacerbated the problem. And this panel is called Women, but I think we shouldn't forget that we're also speaking about girls, both women and girls. And I would just like to add that from my thinking on this. And also to point out that we're soon going to be celebrating the International Day to Eliminate Violence Against Women on November 25th. COVID has brought many problems to women. We are confined to our homes, to institutions, and we are facing tremendous difficulties in dealing with this pandemic during a pandemic.
Shut up.
I would like to remind us that in 1993, the UN adopted the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women. So 30 years later, we are still concerned about this matter. So I would like to begin the panel. We have an excellent panel today, and the panel will begin with voices, two voices. The first will be Marcella Goheen, a playwright from the United States, who is responsible for the Maria Project. So let us first hear the first voice.
Oh, God.
Hi, my name is Marcella Goheen, and I am the author of the play The Maria Project, which world premiered in the United States of America in 2012. July 23rd, 1931, my grandmother, Maria Salazar, was murdered by my grandfather. She was decapitated in front of her 3 children. My mother was one of the 3 children. I suffered moments in my mind, my body, and my spirit until I could put pen to paper to write Maria out of my body into the world so I could give her a voice. I held this moment in my cells until I could understand why this moment was living in my psyche. I wanted to release to peace this trauma moment of so long ago, of ancient memory, grief, tragedy. The poem I'm reading from today is from the prologue of my play, The Maria Project, which I wrote in my grandmother Maria Salazar's memory. The play was heavily influenced by my dear Uncle Frank, who was 5 years old when he witnessed the murder. He saw the decapitation happen. Change lost, entire lineage haunted by your voice, hidden. Where did you go? I hear you daily sing the words of scream. I try to listen so I don't repeat. I fail, learn, listen. Many came before, many after, you for them. I write because it hurts to know you never spoke, but through fragments of your children's voices. Oh, Maria, I hear you. I see you in my dreams at night, wondering how your soul, separate, so cruel, sudden from your body, so young. How do we heal? Envy kills. Forgiveness hires us. Oh, Maria, I hear you. You live in my memory. I am you. You are me. I am here to tell your story. Safe.
Thank you, Marcella. And now we will hear from Kavita, Shakti, Shalili from India.
मैं नेपाल से हूँ और मेरी शादी मैं 25 साल की थी, तो मेरे पापा में शादी के लिए रिश्ते खोज रहे थे और इसी क्रम में किसी ने उनको ये रिश्ता बताया और वो बिहार में सीतामढ़ी जिले में रहने वाले थे और वो लड़का सीए कर रहे थे उस टाइम और वो लड़का जॉब भी कर रहे थे राइट चॉइस में, ये दिल्ली रहता था और सीए भी करता था, राइट चॉइस में जॉब भी करता था। तो उनसे मेरी 2016 अप्रैल 18 को शादी फिक्स हुई और हम दोनों को शादी एक दूसरे को देखकर ही हुआ था। तो मेरी शादी 2016 अप्रैल 18 को हुई थी। तो उसके बाद तो रिचुअल सब पड़ा, जैसे कि हम लोगों बरसाइत, मधुश्रावणी, कोजगरा, दुरागमन ये सब होती है और जितना फेस्टिवल होता है साल भर, उस साल भर में सब फेस्टिवल में मायके से ससुराल में बेटी के लिए कुछ जाता है, जैसे कि साड़ी, कपड़ा और लड़कों के लिए और खाने पीने का सामान। तो उस चीज़ में वो ये बोलता था कि मतलब कुछ भी ना दे और मेरे को पैसे दे दे। जब मैं प्रेग्नेंट थी तो होली का टाइम था, तो उस टाइम में मेरे पिताजी ने इसने बोला कि होली में कुछ सामान ना भेजकर पैसे ही दे दे। तो थोड़ा ये पैसे मांगने लगे, जैसे मेरे घर वालों ने इस पर शंका जताने कि पैसे क्यों मांगता है, इसमें तो रिचुअल में सामान जाता है, तो वो पैसे देना कोई ज़रूरी नहीं है, अगर नहीं है तो हम सामान भी नहीं देंगे अगर नहीं ज़रूरी है। तो जैसे वो मैंने मिक्सिंग, एक होली था उसमें मिक्सिंग का काम था कि खाना पीना बनता है, तो मैंने उनसे बोला कि मिक्सिंग मेरे को दीजिए कि मैं मसाला वो पीसना है। तो उन्होंने तेरे बाप ने मिक्सिंग दिया है तो मिक्सिंग में पीसी की सीट पर पीसना है तो पीस, नहीं तो छोटे। उसी में मैंने बोल दिया कि मेरे पिताजी ने तो जो दिए हैं, अभी मैं खाना भी खाती हूँ उन्हीं का दिया हुआ थाली में खाना खाती हूँ। इसी वजह से उन्होंने मेरे को एक चमेटा मार भी दिए और उसी दिन से वो हर कोई भी बात करती थी अपने मतलब मेरे बाप पर नहीं देंगे कुछ भी, तो वो मारपीट स्टार्ट कर दिए। तो उसके बाद वो बच्चे जब होते हैं तो उसके बाद बच्चों को माँ को बच्चे के 10 चाहिए ना उसको, लेकिन वो भी मेरे ससुराल वालों, सास ससुर कोई भी करने के लिए तैयार नहीं। तो और क्या करे, मेरे मायके में लेकर छोड़। लेकिन वो जब भी फॉर्म भरने का हो, पढ़ने का कुछ भी जरूरी, रूम के रेंट देने का हो, तो मुझसे बोलता था बाप को बोलो कि पैसे देने के लिए कि हम पैसे हमको फॉर्म भरना है। तो मेरी माँ पापा भी नहीं सोचे कि अच्छा चलो मेरे दामाद पढ़ लेंगे तो मेरा ही दामाद पढ़ लेंगे, उससे मेरा बेटी का सुख होगा। तो इसलिए मेरे माँ पापा भी सपोर्ट किए। जब वो 2019 नवंबर में सीए का फाइनल एग्ज़ाम दिए तो 2020 जनवरी को पास हो गए। तो उसके बाद उनके घर वालों ने बहुत दबाव करने लगा कि नहीं, अब ये लड़की के घर से कुछ मिलने वाला है नहीं, तो तुम दूसरी शादी रहेगी, इसको बाप के घर पहुंचा दें, अगर नहीं जाना चाहती है तो नौकर चाकर जैसे काम करेगी रहेगी, लेकिन तुम दूसरा शादी करो। और इसके क्रम में क्या हुआ कि जनवरी, फरवरी, मार्च में लॉकडाउन लगा, मार्च में लगभग शायद लॉकडाउन लगा पहले। तो लॉकडाउन के क्रम में इन लोगों ने प्लान बना लिया कि इसको हम मार देते। और इसमें ऐसा था लॉकडाउन कि हम बाहर में जाना एकदम अलाउ नहीं था, हम बाहर में जाके और बाहर के लोग भी अंदर नहीं आ सकते। तो हमारे पास कोई सपोर्ट नहीं था और हम बहुत डर गए थे और इतना ज़्यादा हम पे अत्याचार कर रहा था, इतना ज़्यादा कि हम उससे बच के निकले तो निकले कैसे, हम इसी सोच में एकदम। लेकिन हम चुरा छुपा कर कभी फ़ोन करके पापा को बताते थे, भैया को बताते थे वहाँ पे फ़ोन करके, और वो लोग भी कुछ नहीं कर पाते थे। अपना जाने रिश्तेदार को भी फ़ोन करते थे कि हाँ ऐसे ऐसी प्रॉब्लम, क्योंकि बहुत सारे मेरी सारी रिश्तेदार करीब करीब इंडिया में ही है, तो लोग फ़ोन करते थे। लेकिन हम इतना कहते थे कि आप लोग फ़ोन मत करिएगा, क्योंकि वो फ़ोन भी मेरे रिश्तेदार को आता था तो मुझे बहुत टर्चर करता था कि तुम फ़ोन पर क्या बात कर रही हो, यही कहना है तुम्हें। जितना वो सिखाता था उतना ही बात मुझे कहने देता था। हम इसके भाई बोल रहा था कि इसको मार दे जान से। एक्चुअली में ये है तो नेपाल की, और अभी कोरोना चल रहा है, कोई पूछेगा तो हम इसको बता देंगे कि ये तो कोरोना से मर गई और इसको आने वाला कोई है नहीं, इसके बाद खोज तलाश करने के लिए बाहर से, और ये अंदर से भी कोई जाने के ये है नहीं। भैया को मैं फ़ोन की और मैं अपने भैया को ये बताई कि भैया मुझे जान की खतरा है, अब बचने का कोई चांस नहीं है। तो भैया ने शक्ति शालिनी को हेल्पलाइन में फ़ोन किए और वहाँ से शक्ति शालिनी को बताया कि ऐसे ऐसे मेरी बहन को प्रॉब्लम है, उनको आप मैंने सेव कर दीजिए कहीं, मतलब जहाँ से उसको मतलब वहाँ से निकाल कर कहीं सेव करके रखें। तो शक्ति शालिनी ने पुलिस को इन्फॉर्म किया और वहाँ से पुलिस वालों ने फिर से दोबारा मुझे निकाल कर शक्ति शालिनी में लाकर रखा। उस बीच में शक्ति शालिनी में आने में मुझे पुलिस वालों ने बार बार मेरे पति को पति को फ़ोन आ रहा है, तुम पति से बात कर लो और तुम पति के घर चली जाओ और महिला निकेतन में ले गया। तो ये दिखाकर मेरे को बोल रहा है कि यहाँ पर तुम रहोगी, तुम्हारे बच्चों को भी मार देगा और तुमको भी मार देगा, इसी वजह से तुम अपने पति के घर चल जाओ। और तुम्हारा पति तो बार बार तुम्हें फ़ोन कर रहा है। बाद में लास्ट में जब नहीं मानी तो शक्ति शालिनी में ले आकर रख दिया।
Thank you. And now we will begin with panel 1 on women. Our first I have a few housekeeping details to mention. The panelists are being invited to speak for 5 to 7 minutes, and there will be a 10-minute question and answer period at the end of each panel, which we hope you'll all be present for. All right, I'm going to begin with the first speaker, the Honourable Christine St. Pierre from Canada. She has been a Vice President and Special Commission of the Special Commission on the Sexual Exploitation of Minors. She has been a member of the Québec National Assembly and a former Minister on the Status of Women. Christine, please begin. Nice to see you.
Bonjour. It is a great honor for me to take part in this very important summit. Indeed, domestic violence knows no borders. Sadly, the global COVID-19 pandemic has increased the number of calls for help. Here in Canada, all indicators point in the same direction. Our domestic violence shelters report a dramatic increase in requests for help. A Toronto women organization says it received 55,000 distress calls between March and September. The urgency and magnitude have intensified with COVID. The United Nations is even talking about shadow pandemic. Job loss, bankruptcy, isolation, the combination is explosive, and the pandemic gives attackers the opportunity to increase their control over their victims. For example, women awaiting a COVID-19 test are evicted from their homes. Immigrant women with precarious status hesitate to leave an abusive relationship. They wonder, if I am a refugee, do I have the right to report the abuse? Furthermore, there is no specific offense for domestic violence in Canada, unlike other jurisdictions around the world. The charges, if any, relate to assault, sexual assault, or criminal harassment. Oxford University doctoral student Susan Zakur, in a book titled The Rape Factory, shows that Canadian law does not criminalize the regime of terror that men inflict on their spouse. Victims, she said, live in a controlled environment maintained by isolation, threats, surveillance, intimidations, and denigrations, end of the quote. On October 5th, in the House of Commons in Canada, the New Democratic Party introduced Bill C-247. It proposes to create a new offense in Canadian Criminal Code by making controlling or coercive conduct in an intimate relationship a criminal offense. The project is modeled on English law. The new offense would apply to behavior that leads to reasonable fear that a person may be subjected to violence and that the situation is causing prejudice to her physical or mental health and can even lead to a state of mental disorder, fear, or anguish. The law would apply to both spouses, former spouses, common law spouses, and even romantic partners. People living in a climate of violence should not have to wait until they are physically assaulted before they can get help, argues the NDP. The bill proposes prison sentences of up to 5 years. In Canada, the criminal code is under federal jurisdictions, but that does not prevent provinces from acting. In 1995, Québec adopted a government action plan on domestic violence titled Preventing, Detecting, Ending Domestic Violence. The new action plan draft under this policy is increased support for community resources in addition to law enforcement. It also plans to better meet the needs of immigrants, members of LGBT population, people with disabilities, and young people. Speaking of young people, the National Assembly of Quebec launched more than a year ago a large special commission on sexual exploitation of minors, of which I am vice president. Our report containing some 60 recommendations will be tabled next month. In the course of our work, we heard several organizations that assist victims of sexual exploitation describe how they are recruited by pimps. While every case of sexual exploitation is unique, the fact remains that relationships often begin with a romantic relationship. In the beginning, the victim thinks she is in a relationship with his pimp who will wave his web around her to lead her to prostitution. The pimp will use seduction to fulfill the emotional deficiencies of his victim. He makes her believe that he is madly in love with her. He seeks her moral and financial support. He manipulates her psychologically and exploits her vulnerability to make her consider erotic dance or prostitution favorably. Then comes the control of spineless movements of the victim, the snatching of her identity papers, the threats, the assault, the manipulation. A real climate of terror sets in. It deprives her of food and clothing, threatens to attack family members. It will also force her to go to work in other Canadian cities, such as Vancouver and Moncton or Toronto. Montreal is considered the hub of the sexual exploitation of minors in Canada, a sad record. In the population, based on our observations, a real awareness has yet to be developed. The commodification of the body is trivialized. Due to a lack of human and financial resources, the police forces allocate those resources mostly to the fight against pimping and human trafficking. In 2017, a special team was set up in the Integrated Pimping Control Team. There have been few arrests of clients, even if their activity is criminalized. Our work shows that more work needs to be done on this front. 39% of victims are under 18, according to the latest data from the Ministry of Public Security. And what about the impact of COVID-19 in all of this? Well, as you might expect, it gives sexual predators an opportunity to take advantage of the vulnerable young who are confined to their homes since they receive their education online. Police authorities note an increase of 50% in the reports of sexual exploitation. The company MindGig, which owns the pornographic site Pornhub, greatly benefits from the current situation. The site saw its traffic increases by 23% according to the journalist Martin Patriquin. MindGig employs over 1,000 people in Montreal. Pornhub receives 115 million visitors per day, 42 billion per year, and it has 6 million videos, according to The Guardian. The most popular theme search is teenagers, and it was shown in court that filming is done under force and threats. Are we far from domestic violence? Not in my opinion, because most of the time, it also starts with a romantic relationship. Domestic violence has several devastating effects, and the ramification can be wide. This is the reflection that I wanted to bring to your attention. I wish you an excellent summit, and I thank Mrs. Danieli for the honor of inviting me at this prestigious event. Merci et bonne journée.
Thank you very much, Ms. St. Pierre. Our next speaker is the Honourable Kasturi Pato from Malaysia. She's a member of Parliament and board member of Parliamentarians for Global Action. Please share your views with us, Kasturi.
Thank you very much, Kristen. I hope everyone can hear me. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. First and foremost, I would like to express my gratitude and thanks for organizing this important and timely international summit and for inviting me to address this issue as a member of Parliament from Malaysia, and also for to my fellow speakers for what I envision will be an enriching conversation. I'm a board member of the Parliamentarians for Global Action, the largest non-governmental multi-party international network of individual legislators acting in their individual capacity to inform and mobilize parliamentarians in all regions of the world to advocate for human rights and the rule of law, democracy, human security, inclusion, and gender equality. Our membership comprises approximately 1,300 members from 130 parliaments around the world. And I'm delighted that later today you will be also hearing from Mino Tavares, former legislator in the Dominican Republic and former PGA president. And tomorrow from the Honourable Denita Gatti, Member of Parliament from Kenya. MPs have a key role to play in national and global efforts to promote and protect human rights, democracy and peace in their capacity as lawmakers in their government oversight functions and as representatives of the people who play important leadership roles in their own communities. Therefore, we have a crucial task in overseeing and providing accountability for our government's COVID-19 response and to ensure that this response is cognizant of its gendered impact. As we all deal with this pandemic in this time, most countries face a health crisis and an economic crisis. But like the US, Malaysia is also facing a third crisis, which is a political crisis. And when you have these three crises come together, it is a recipe for disaster, and which ultimately will lead to the erosion of human rights. And in this case, the voices of women, the voices of girls, the voices of minorities, the voices of the marginalized will continue to be unheard until and unless governments sit up, wake up, and put the issue of the rights of women, protection, and shelter as part of a national agenda as they combat COVID-19. Many times we hear, generally speaking, men at the drawing board trying to find a vaccine, trying to ensure that their borders are protected, trying to ensure that there's movement control orders, etc. But it is also at this time that a part of this initiatives and efforts taken by individual governments to contain the spread of this virus, you also find an infection that is happening within the four walls of your home, which is domestic violence. In Malaysia, there has been a steady increase in the number of domestic violence cases. And if you look at the trend from March to June this year, we had seen 930 reported cases through Talian Kasih, which is a hotline number set up by the Welfare Department under the Ministry of Women's Development, Family and Community. And just yesterday, my question came up in Parliament to request for the number of calls that had come in on all kinds of, whether it's domestic violence, sexual violence against children, attempted suicide, counseling, etc. And the number that had come in was 159,000 cases from January to November 2020, with a breakdown of various of these categories that I had mentioned. But in the Malaysian context, and I believe in many countries in the world, the devil is in the details. It's data, data, data. And if no government is going to sit up and say, guys, we need to look at the numbers, and the numbers are not pretty, and the numbers are not nice, and the numbers are not good, and we need to do something about it. Until and unless a government acknowledges that they have a problem by looking at these numbers, until then, there would not be any solution or practical solutions in place for us to deal with this pandemic of domestic violence in the middle of this COVID-19. And it is sad to say that not just in Malaysia, but globally, with an exponential trend of particularly violence against women. In Malaysia, we have also seen a spike of sexual violence against children, which is extremely disappointing. The answer that was given in Parliament yesterday was not complete. It did not totally answer my question, which is very, very disappointing, which means, in other words, whether the government is afraid to deal with the matter or not. which is why it is important for civil society, which is why it is important for religious leaders, community leaders, academicians to come together so that it would be a cocktail of ideas, brainstorming. You cannot use your modus operandi that you have used in the past to deal with domestic violence or violence against women or gender-based violence and even sexual violence against children at a time like this. You have to have a new formula, a new recipe, a heads-on approach, an assertive stand on how the government wants to or needs to deal with this matter. And I believe the statistics across the board that would be shared by my fellow esteemed colleagues would also show that in their countries, perhaps there is an increase, or if there is even no increase, there might be a plateau, a number of domestic violence cases. It's very scary here in Malaysia, only because we are still dealing with an issue of when cases are brought to the authorities, from that point onwards, for the victim to gain access to justice, to aid, to shelter, to advice, to protection is always a blurred scenario. And this is what civil society has been advocating, and this is what we have been also reminding the government in Parliament. Apart from that, Malaysia has no law on stalking yet. And we find that many times when we speak about domestic violence, we often forget about the crime of stalking, which could lead to domestic violence. And even after the act is committed, the crime is committed, victims are still exposed to that act of stalking by their partners, which is extremely scary and often overlooked. Apart from that, Malaysia has yet to table a bill on sexual harassment, which is also something we need to look at as we cover the various types of domestic violence, from control to blame, economic abuse, emotional abuse, intimidation and threats, sexual abuse, physical abuse, coercion, stalking, harassment, marital rape, and bullying all fall in the category of domestic abuse. And in one way or another, when domestic abuse happens in a nation and it is not counted in the way that it should be, when governments don't put it as part of a national agenda, when sexual violence happens to girls and it's not on the national agenda, that affects the economy of the country. And at a time like this, with an economic crisis plaguing nations, many nations in the world, if governments are not part of the solution, then governments are part of the problem. And I hope if my esteemed colleagues here and also other attendees who are listening in from Malaysia, I hope you can compel your members of parliament to raise all these matters so we can speak about domestic violence as a chorus of lawmakers who are pushing for real reforms within the system. And apart from that, I think, in other words, the role to legislate, the role to scrutinize would be something I believe parliamentarians can push their parliaments to take upon, to introduce and support amendments to response and recovery legislation, stimulus packages and budgets, social protection policies, to oversee that government's emergency legislation, relief packages and budgets have specifically responded to known gender policy implications. For example, asking parliamentary questions to relevant ministers. So I hope at the end of this conference that we'll all be able to share our stories and learn from each other. I, for one, I'm privileged to be sharing this stage, this platform with my esteemed colleagues, and would like to hear your success stories and best practices that you have carried out in your individual countries so that I can bring it back home to be used in Malaysia. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kasturi, for sharing your ideas about what governments should be doing and your experience in Malaysia. We now turn to Lopa Banerjee, who is from India, and she's the director of the Civil Society Division in the UN Women.
Thank you so much. Greetings to everybody, and I hope that all of you and your loved ones are safe and well. and I continue to wish for all your continued health and safety. Thank you so much for this very, very important conversation at this critical time.
Lopa, could you turn your volume up a little bit, please?
Can you hear me well now?
That's much better. Oh no, a little bit more, a little bit more. Yael says she can't hear you.
I am actually at the highest.
Okay, that's good.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
okay.
Thank you.
Very good. I was saying, first of all, thank you very, very much for hosting this very important discussion at this critical time. 2020 was meant to be the grand, glorious celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. 25 years after the Fourth World Conference on Women, we should have been in a place marking success, achievement, progress, and celebrating the end of violence against women and girls. Because in terms of gender equality, it is the most egregious example, manifestation of discrimination and inequality against women and girls. Instead, 25 years after Beijing and before the pandemic, at the beginning of 2020, the report of the United Nations Secretary General on gender equality, 25 years after Beijing, found that 18% of women and girls aged between 15 and 49 years who had intimate partners had been subject to sexual or physical violence by these partners in the previous 12 months. In some countries, that figure was 24%. Before the pandemic, these statistics were still underreported because less than 40% of women who experience violence across the world actually report or seek help. In many contexts, the law is simply not on the side of women and girls. 1 in 4 countries across the world has no law specifically protecting women and girls from domestic violence. So prior to the pandemic and 25 years after the ratification of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which was meant to be the blueprint for gender equality, 25 years after that, we were still in a moment of an epidemic of violence across the world against women and girls. And then the pandemic happened. And the pandemic, in a matter of 7 months, rolled back legislation, policies, and prevention measures that were in place inadequately in society. But it rolled it back to the point that we saw a spike from existing epidemic levels of violence that I just spoke of. We saw a spike in 7 months of 20% increase in violence across the world, and in some countries as high as 40%. So what I'm trying to say here is that the measures that we had in place were so fragile that they were able to be rolled back so rapidly. Measures that it had taken us 25 years to put in place were rolled back in a matter of 7 months. And that is the reality of this moment and the crisis that we are facing at this point in time. Speakers before me have highlighted how serious the situation is in terms of some of the points that they made. I'm going to talk about a few statistics just for you to get a sense of this. Cities and out of the cities and countries that are reporting, only 48 countries across the world are treating gender-based violence-related services as an integral part of their national and local COVID-19 response plans. To make matters worse, in some countries, resources and efforts have been diverted away from violence response to immediate COVID relief. So what we are seeing also is that even though health workers and frontline workers for COVID, 70% of those are women, only about 30% of leaders across the global health sector are women, and therefore decision-making for COVID response is happening without women at the table. And this is why we continue to see this moment of crisis. So going forward, UN Women has put forward a set of key asks of policymakers. Number one, short-term response to COVID must include declaring shelters and multi-sectoral gender-based violence services as essential services. Number two, adapting and strengthening existing services to the current situation of restricted mobility so that restricted mobility does not restrict services. Number three, increasing investment in online services and to civil society organizations that are working to prevent gender-based violence and support victims of gender-based violence. Number four, making sure that judicial systems continue to prosecute abusers, that judicial systems are not diverted away from this work during the COVID response. Creating safer ways for women to seek support without alerting their abusers, because when women are within their homes and in lockdown conditions, they are within the presence of their abusers. And so there must be a way in which they are able to reach services without knowledge of their abusers. And scaling up public awareness campaigns, particularly those targeted at men and boys. You heard earlier about the Secretary General's call, the United Nations Secretary General's call to accelerate gender-based violence measures. The Secretary General has called for an accelerated and concrete policy response to gender-based violence and to promote zero tolerance of gender-based violence across all spheres of society everywhere. The focus is on three things. One, to activate decision makers, that government leaders and local authorities to be strategically engaged to commit to the Secretary General's appeal on gender-based violence and make explicit commitments in response and to mobilize other governments in their region. Number two, for public mobilization for positive change, coordinated social mobilization of the public to promote a zero tolerance to violence approach. And third, Kasturi referred to this, data for results. Data is crucial and data is at the heart of the strategy, because without data, there is no going forward. There are four legs to this. The political engagement strategy calls to fund, prevent, respond, and collect. Fund, Prioritize funding for a minimum package of essential services that include gender-based violence prevention in COVID-19 fiscal stimulus packages. Make flexible funding available for women's rights organizations working at the nexus of COVID-19 and gender-based violence, and prioritize funding for gender-based violence prevention and response in the global humanitarian response plan for COVID-19 and the UN socioeconomic impact framework. Declare national zero tolerance policy for gender-based violence with a concrete plan in place. Launch COVID-19 behavior change social mobilization campaigns. Respond, undertake explicit measures so that services for survivors of gender-based violence are maintained as essential during COVID lockdowns, and ensure a continued and substantial criminal justice response system. Also ensure that minimum essential services are maintained and adopted. And finally, collect data for the improvement of gender-based violence services and programs. UN Women, through the Generation Equality Campaign and the Generation Equality Action Coalition on Gender-Based Violence, is bringing together the first ever multi-stakeholder and intergenerational platform with the objective of creating a compelling political compact and driving long-term change to end gender-based violence. I want to end by saying that this moment in time, if we are talking about building back better, we are not talking about building back better patriarchal systems. We are talking about building back differently and transformed. This calls for ambition, it calls for radical action, and it calls for impatience to make sure that we work together in solidarity, but putting the accelerated, urgent action at the core, and placing women at the decision-making tables so that dramatic and radical action can be taken to build back differently, so that we get to a point where we are not in this stage where violence becomes the bigger pandemic after COVID. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lopa, for your comprehensive and impassioned presentation. I would just like to point out that for some people you were too loud. The chat, they say you were too loud. And part of the reason, I believe, is that people are not turning off their mute when they're not speaking. If you are not speaking, it would be good for everyone to turn off your mute. Okay, so now let's move on. The next speaker is Dubravka Šimonovic from Croatia. She's the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. Dubravka, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this important International Summit on Domestic and Family Violence during COVID-19 pandemic as United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, its causes and consequences. This mandate was established in 1994, 1 year before the Beijing Fourth World Women's Conference, in order to send a clear message that violence against women is a human rights violation and that there is a state responsibility to prevent violence against women as gender-based violence, inclusive of girls, of course, to provide services for protection of victims and to prosecute perpetrators, all in holistic and coordinated manner. So during this COVID-19 pandemic, I have started immediately with press release on 27th March this year at the beginning of the pandemic. And I have called all states to continue to combat domestic violence during this pandemic and to ensure that the measures to protect victims are available during this pandemic, because it was visible from media reports that there are many reports on increased forms of violence against women and specifically domestic violence. Also, as a second move, I have issued a call to all stakeholders to send me more data and information about availability of different services during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I have posed specific questions about availability of shelters, protection orders, and other measures. They should be regularly available. I have received an unprecedented number of inputs, 274. And also as an additional move from my mandate, I have included on mandate's website reference document with responses from other agencies, UN Women, Office of the High Commissioner, but also non-governmental organizations, regional mechanisms comparable to mine that also issue different recommendations and statements, because suddenly we had many recommendations related to violence against women and COVID-19 pandemic. So based on submissions received, I have prepared a report to General Assembly on intersection between COVID-19 pandemic and pandemic of gender-based violence against women with focus on domestic violence, and also as support to United Nation Secretary General call for peace at home. I have just presented this report to the third committee on 9th October this year. So based on all those submissions, it was clear that at the beginning, gender-blind restrictive measures were undertaken by governments all over the world, and they had negative effects on availability of violence against women and domestic violence prevention and protection measures. We have seen fewer police interventions, closure of courts, impossibility to have protection orders and limited access to justice, closure of shelters, and also reduced access to reproductive health services. But also I have received reports on good practices that showed that many states responded and non-governmental organizations responded with additional adopted measures that were responding to needs in this COVID-19 situation, like online services, e-protection orders, SMS helplines that had increased number of calls. So there are different measures that are showing that regular measures could and should be adapted to COVID-19 pandemic situation. Then it was also clear that women and girls from disadvantaged and marginalized group were affected by intersectional forms of discrimination. They were harder hit by both pandemics of gender-based violence that preceded COVID-19 pandemic and also a combination of both. Many NGOs and NGOs lost funding during this pandemic. And what was important was also a lack of comparable data to really compare situation in different countries. So in my report, I have produced recommendations to state and other stakeholders. And main issue is really to address pre-existing gaps with respect to prevention, provision of services and prosecution of perpetrators in a holistic manner, but also in line with international human rights instruments that we have. Here I would like to flag out Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, but also the CEDAW Convention and the new General Recommendation number 35 that updated General Recommendation 19 on gender-based violence against women, that are providing clear roadmap what needs to be done. Because we have seen that during the COVID-19 pandemic, pre-existing gaps, they were more exposed and more visible, but they are still there. In many countries, there are no shelters. In many countries, there are no efficient protection orders. There are no risk assessment policy for police officers. There are many shortcomings. So it would be important really to focus on all those measures that would put national laws and practice in line with adopted international standards in this area. So I am also seeing a very important focus on human rights perspective, because all those services are not only essential services, they are also human rights obligations, because they are based on international instruments accepted by numerous governments around the world. And we need to see how to encourage governments to uphold those commitments in order to secure those services. So in my report, you will see that I am encouraging all countries to look into all those pre-existing gaps and shortcomings, but also to adapt those measures that should be adapted to COVID-19 pandemic. With respect to, for example, helplines, they should be available 24 hours, 7 all the time, but also now during the COVID, we need more flexibilities with respect to how to reach helplines. Text measures should be available. Different internet providers should also open up. And then there are good examples, for example, with pharmacies and others that could receive messages that help for victims is needed. Then e-protection orders, then hotel accommodation instead of shelters when shelters are not available due to COVID restrictions and so on. Obstetric and reproductive health services should be also available, should not be restricted due to this COVID pandemic, and NGOs should be provided with increased support. But let me now turn to importance of that data that was mentioned by previous speakers. And I would like to encourage all of you to look at Mandate's website. And there is a new femicide watch call for this year that is calling all states to collect comparable data on gender-related killings of women or femicides. And it is very important to see that from such data, we can see comparison of respect to situation before the COVID pandemic and during the COVID pandemic, and we will be able to compare afterwards what is going on. Many countries do not see this type of data as a part of violence against women data, and this is a problem. This is part of violence against women data, and countries have responsibility to extract from homicide data on intimate partner killings, family-related killings, and other gender-related killings of femicides. So terminology should not be an obstacle. Some countries could call it femicides, others could call it intimate partner killings or intimate partner homicides, but it is important that we have comparable categories for all countries all over the world. And in two categories, on intimate partner killings and family-related killings, we do have comparable categories based on relationship between victim and perpetrator. And this is something what is happening in all parts of the world. And today we are having clear picture that in case of intimate partner killings, out of 10 persons killed, more than 80% are women. More than 8 or 9 are women. So this is clearly showing that focus should be on preventive measures. So for this reason, I think that we really need to focus on this type of data, that administrative data that would be collected each year, published each year as a first step. But then second step is analysis of cases by interdisciplinary bodies. I'm calling all states to establish a femicide watch or observatories on violence against women, and other bodies that could be multidisciplinary bodies that would look into all cases of femicides or gender-related killings in order to determine key shortcomings at the national level related to law or police intervention or availability of services and so on, and recommend measures to prevent such deaths in the future. And third leg that I have added this year would be commemoration of victims, to have emblematic cases for educational purposes, and to commemorate all victims around the world that are victims of this type of lethal killing of women. So I hope that from what we have seen up to now, because many states have started with this Femicide Watch, observatories on violence against women, also academic institutions, non-governmental organizations could do it. And now we are seeing more and more comparable data that are really showing in which countries we are having increase or decrease of this type of violence. Also data on other types of violence could be very important. Now I'm working on a report on criminal justice systems and rape with idea to produce model law on rape. And data that I have received is showing that in this area, there are so many differences in different states with respect to how rape is criminalized, not in line with international standards. And for that reason, we have to see how to really address all those obstacles from human rights perspective in order to go in direction of reduction of gender-based violence against women, and to have all those nice goals that we have in SDG agenda and other human rights instruments that we have adopted, but not yet fully implemented. And now I'm looking at Kristen Timothy, because I remember Kristen from time when we were working together at the level of the Commission on the Status of Women. My final recommendation would be that we need to look how to improve work of the Commission on the Status of Women, and to have a consideration of violence against women at each session of the CSW. Currently, CSW is looking at violence against women, domestic violence, femicides, political violence against women, and so on. Only after each 6 years, because CSW is following Beijing Platform for Action cycle with respect to 12 areas of concern. But now we are living in completely different world. With this COVID pandemic, I think that at each session of the CSW, at the next session, we need to discuss this intersection between COVID-19 pandemic and violence against women. And also at each session of the CSW, I hope that in the future, we will be able to discuss different forms of gender-based violence against women and girls. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dubravka, for your extensive work and for your presentation. We now turn to Riitta Särkelä from Finland. She's the Secretary General of the Federation of Mother and Child Homes and Shelters. Riitta, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I would like first very warmly thank the organizers to organize this very important event. It's very crucial that we combine all our energies and efforts to prevent and to work violence against women. And I also thank the opportunity to speak in this panel. I'm honored to do that. And I'm working in an NGO, so my perspective comes from NGO world. And in Finland, the pandemic has hit most severely to those most vulnerable. That's the same case in other countries, I'm sure, but that has happened in Finland as well. In my short input, I will have 3 different angles to domestic violence in Finland during the COVID-19 era. First, I would like to tell you about some statistics, then about some policy measures which has been taken in Finland, and then I have also some concerns connected to future. Of course, I understand that we need to have very strong and very quick actions, but also I think it's very important that we work very strongly on the long term and try and really make a change in domestic violence, and especially violence against women. We need to stop this development. So if we think Finland as a country, we are in quite many things we say that we are good, and we are maybe the best country in the world, but connected to the violence against women, we need to shame, because every third woman between age 15 to 74 in Finland is experiencing violence or threat of violence of it in close relationships. That is our failure. It's really a failure in our country that the situation is like this. And it's completely against every woman's human rights and right everyone to live without violence. So that's the starting point. That was the case already before the COVID-19 started. First, some statistics about the wideness of domestic violence in Finland during the COVID-19 era. First, something about how police has met this issue. And the number of house calls by police has increased a lot in Finland. The increase between January to June has been 30%, but in the capital area, in Helsinki area, it has been even 47%. It's really a high increase. And it's important to notice that meanwhile, the number of domestic violence cases reported to the police has decreased, and also the cases taken into the court has decreased. So something is missing in between, because the legislation is quite and clear in Finland that the violence against women in our law, it's very clear that it's something we will have consequences, legal consequences. And one thing which was a bit amazing, that during the COVID-19 era, all the cases of domestic violence were likely reported to the police. And maybe it's possible because the police got more information about these older cases when responding to emergency house calls during the lockdown. That's something we need to find out more, what is behind this information. And if we think the statistics as a whole in Finland, violence towards a partner and children increased during the first half of 2020 about 12%. So all the official statistics are saying there's increase. NGOs such as ours have had and have an important role to play in Finland in preventing and offering support for survivors of domestic violence. Our federation started shelters in Finland in 1979, so 40 years ago, and still most of the shelters in Finland are run by our federation. But luckily, since 2015, they are funded by the state, and that the reason for that is that Istanbul Convention was ratified in Finland. So there's quite a solid funding basis at the moment for shelters, and we are really, really happy of that, because earlier it was on full risk of us NGOs to meet those needs in crisis situations. The shelters in Finland were working and are working normally during COVID-19 era. So that is not a problem. We have been able to continue the work and give help in acute crisis situations. But I think it's very important to notice that during the lockdown, the number of clients or women decreased who were coming to the shelters. And we were a bit astonished about the situation. What has happened? Shelters are open and they are free, and women could go there, but no, they didn't show up. So we found out that there may be many reasons for that. And one reason is maybe that we had very clear and strong instructions in Finland to stay at home. I'm sure that while Finns are very obedient people with recommendations, women in very severe situations stayed at home because that was the recommendation. That's one reason, but it's not the whole story. And of course, one other reason could be also that there was a fear of getting the virus from the shelter. But we as an NGO have the understanding that one even more important reason for that was that the victims have had really difficulties to contact the service provider or leave their homes when the perpetrator is present all the time at home. So that's our fear. And after these first months in the COVID area, the situation has normalized with the shelters. Victims or survivors are getting to the shelters and seeking for help. So situation is more normal at the moment. But we as an NGO, like many other NGOs, made big changes in our work when the COVID period started in Finland. We strengthened and made special arrangements to give our outpatient services. And what we found out during the first months in spring, that people seeking help from our outpatient services increased 40%. That's a lot, 40% more compared to last year. And what is important as well is that also perpetrators have been seeking for help. And for us, it's important because we find, and we normally also work with victims or survivors, children, plus perpetrators. And we think it's very important that we concentrate and work also with the perpetrators to break the circle of violence. So that's something would happen, that they were also seeking for help in Finland. And one thing which was important in Finland during this COVID-19 area, that NGOs got special funding for 6 months to meet the new needs which this pandemic had caused in Finland. And I think it was very important because we, for instance, as an NGO, could have an opportunity to widen the opening times of our anonymous chat services in the spring very widely. And during the first months of this spring, I would say maybe mid-May, the situation was that we had managed to meet during these chat services a much higher amount of people in need than in the whole year 2019. And one thing which was very important in Finland as well, that we got quite good help from media to tell about people that violence in the family is not something you need to tolerate. It's important that you seek for help and seek for help as early as possible. And our message was, help is available. Do not hesitate to seek for help. And I think it has been helpful because the public awareness has been quite good in Finland, that people have realized that this phenomenon has increased in Finland. Then some policy developments in Finland, which I would like to share with you as well. Our Prime Minister Sanna Marin and her government has been quite well devoted to the work against domestic violence, and it's strongly shown in the Finnish government's program in many ways. A new action plan for combating violence against women was established this year with 32 actions, for example, to combat digital and honor-related violence, and some resources were also allocated to that work.
Riitta, could you bring your presentation to a close? You've sort of exceeded the time allowed, but it's most interesting. Just try to wrap up, please.
Okay, I will do it. So the government has also established a post for an independent rapporteur for violence against women, and also the funding of shelters is quite safe at the moment. quickly about some future concerns. It's very important that Istanbul Convention is very important legal basis and tool in combating and preventing domestic violence for all of us. The states have main responsibility, but it calls
El Estado mantiene la responsabilidad de unirse a este trabajo.
There seems to be a backlash in women's rights globally.
Puede que a nivel mundial
we need to make,
los feminicidios sigan siendo un gran problema y haya un retroceso incluso durante la pandemia.
I'm hearing somebody else's work speaking.
Pero disculpen, estoy hablando de algo que no fueron mis conclusiones.
Maybe I'll finish with that.
Tal vez terminaré.
It's very important that this backlash can be stopped and an Istanbul Convention taken seriously in all European countries, and also the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals should be a really important tool for us to show the future way. Thank you for your attention.
Sorry, now we turn, thank you very much, Riitta, for that comprehensive presentation. We now turn to our last panelist, Tamar Schwartz from Israel. She's the Chief Executive Officer of Ruach Nashit, Women's Spirit. Tamar, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I guess you're a little bit tired, but I will try to make it. I'm so privileged to be here. I first want to thank so much to Dr. Yael Danieli that was so generous to invite me. Thank you, Yael. And I'm also privileged to be 32 years social worker and the CEO of Women's Spirit. In Hebrew, it's Ruach Nashit. And we focus on economic violence because this is the first factor that leaves the woman victim of violence in the violent home. In Israel, almost half of the women that are getting out of the violent home are coming back to the husband because of the economic dependency. It's a very cruel tool of control. And we help the woman by mentoring the woman, hundreds every year and thousands through the years. We help them through private and long mentoring of 2 years every week to become economically independent, to open a bank account, to know how to run a bank account, to go to work, to provide for themselves and to provide for their children, and not to go back to the violent husband. We have hundreds of mentors and coaches all over Israel, from the north to the south. And we are also dealing with the comprehensive domain, because it's not enough to escort women victims of violence in the private domain, because the regulation and the laws in Israel, and I think all over the world, I read in the chat that someone wrote that governments are horrible all over the world. So also in Israel, we have a problem, and I'm saying it not from a political point of view. It doesn't matter if it is right or left, you know. Everybody should be against violence against women. And we have regulations that are very harsh, and we try to change them, especially in the COVID. And I will give examples. In the COVID, our clients, we call them participants, because this is the most equal term that we know. They participate in their rehabilitation program. What happened, and most of them were fired from work because many working places were closed. And the one that weren't getting out of work need to stay in the home with the children, because the educational system was closed for a long time. And the father is not an active father, the violent fathers. So they had to stay home with the children. So, or you have to get out of work, or you had work, but you had to stay at home. So many of them came to a very horrible state. Usually we say in Women's Spirit, we are an NGO, an Israeli NGO, and usually we say that we give the tools to fish. We don't give the fish. We don't give the concrete help. We teach them how to be independent. But in the COVID, what happened? The women call us and say, I don't have what to eat. So I tell you, we went from home to home and gave them ticket for the supermarket to buy food. And also we bought a lot of computers, laptops, because they couldn't communicate through Zoom. And this is a very, very important tool for working, also for economic independence. Another thing that we did was that in Israel, there is an institute for social security that give the women that doesn't get the alimony allowance, the social security give her a small allowance. But what happened? If she is fired from work, she get unemployment allowance. And in Israel, you cannot get two allowances. Or you get the unemployment, or you get the alimony's money. And of course, the alimonies are for the children. It's not for her. So we made a big struggle. We wrote letters for the Israeli parliament called Knesset, and phone calls, and even demonstration. You know, we stood there in Jerusalem with the speaker and cry out loud. It's so cruel not to give the alimony's allowance. And luckily, we succeed on this. And the Social Security Institute decided that in the case of older people and also women that are raising their children alone, they will get the two allowance together. Another thing that we try to promote as we deal with economic violence, we call it, you know, the violence that you don't see the signs. The blue signs are in the bank account, not on the body. Economic violence, that means that the husband holds the bank account. Even if she works, he takes all the money, all the salary. He gives her money like pocket money. She's like a child. She's all dependent on him. And also, if the husband takes loans and he's dealing in a bad manner with the money, he put all the house in a very bad shape, the woman, even if she divorces him, she must pay all the loans, all the debts. Even if they go to court and the husband say, I admit I made all the loans alone, my wife didn't know anything, she have to pay. Why? Because in Israel, I think also in the rest of the world, but for Israel, I know for sure, the husband and the wife are considered to be one entity, one legal entity. So if the debts were been made while the couple was married, then the two of them must pay. And now there is a law that is being discussed in the parliament. We wrote the law 5 years ago, and we try to promote it for 5 years. You see how long it takes in Israel to promote laws? I don't know how it is in your countries. In Israel, it's a long time. And now it's been discussed the first time in the parliament. And the member of the parliament say what they think of this law. And one of the member of the parliament say, I know why you want this law. If the woman is spending 10,000 of shekel, then the husband should not permit it. But for sure, the law is not for this. The law is just to let the woman or the man, the one that was hurt by the other partner, to allow the one that was hurt to sue in court, in civil court, and to ask for the money back that he was being taken off. Thank you so much. I have so much to say, but only 7 minutes. I hope I was right on time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tamar, and for being so good about time. Now we have had an incredible experience with this panel. Thank you so much. The next thing on our agenda is to listen to voices. And then we'll come back to the panel and have a quick Q&A. And I might just suggest to participants that if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A so we can address them at the end of this panel. Thank you very much. Let's hear some voices.
Eu sou Alexandre Colli, ex-atleta de futebol profissional e agora diretor do futebol viral mundial. Sou uma pessoa apaixonada por futebol em ajudar as pessoas fazendo bem através do futebol, pessoal. Envio saudações aos meus amigos brasileiros, essa grande nação brasileira, mas infelizmente estamos vivendo um momento muito difícil e alarmante, que é a violência doméstica, devido ao confinamento que tem um vírus no ar, esse Covid-19, pessoal. O que fazer sobre isso? O que fazer nesse momento? Primeiro, quero dar uma pausa aqui, levantar uma bandeira, muito preocupante, muito alarmante esse momento que estamos vivendo. A violência doméstica no Brasil tem crescido 40%, 42% de boletins de ocorrências registrados. Isso, logicamente, é preocupante e não podemos fechar os olhos, tá? Quero convidar a todos vocês, na verdade, convocar vocês para a gente começar a dar um basta nisso. A agressão física contra a mulher, a agressão contra os pais, mães, essa agressão emocional contra as crianças que estão presenciando isso, nós não podemos fechar os olhos, pessoal. Todas as intervenções e os métodos convencionais não funcionaram e as coisas estão cada vez mais complicadas. Será que é certo condenar, denunciar os abusadores, separar as vítimas das suas famílias? Não tinha solucionado a violência antes. E agora, com as medidas de quarentena, elas estão ainda menos práticas, quer dizer, não resolveu o problema até agora. Então nós resolvemos, de uma forma diferente e alegre, criar o futebol viral mundial, gente. Extremamente empolgante, divertido, e é hora de a gente exercitar os músculos da paciência. Quero que você exercite também. Um time super capacitado aqui do Brasil e de fora do Brasil, usando a sua criatividade em fazer algo diferente. Uma proposta super legal e envolvente. Afinal, neste momento, os homens trancados em casa, pessoal, eles ficam mais entediados, ficam mais violentos. E para curar esse tédio, oferecemos um remédio super divertido, que é o futebol viral mundial. Jogar futebol em casa, pessoal. Vamos jogar, eu jogo aqui em casa com meu filho. Fazer desafios de interação com todos. Criamos o Clube do Livro, o Clube da Leitura, com diversos assuntos de leitura. Falar sobre futebol, é claro. E ainda uma live de educação financeira. O momento exige isso, o momento exige cuidar das nossas finanças, hein, pessoal? Visite nossa página no culturalagentes.org. Afinal, todo mundo é apaixonado por futebol, mesmo quando se trata de atividades fora de campo, como estamos fazendo aqui agora. Vamos unir nossas famílias, convoco vocês para unir as suas famílias, com o prazer de todos e uma boa cultura esportiva. Vamos entrar em campo como se fosse uma final de Copa do Mundo. Vamos juntos vencer esse jogo, pessoal. Mas antes, espera aí, eu quero convidar vocês para um super desafio, legal e divertido. Você contar uma história sobre o futebol. 1 minuto e meio aí, uma história dentro de campo, fora de campo, na arquibancada, no sofá da sua casa. Algo alegre, divertido e descontraído. Eu quero ver o seu vídeo, vou ver todos os vídeos de vocês, hein? Mas tá feito o desafio, tá bom? Um grande abraço a todos, um excelente evento.
Thank you very much to Alexander Colli of Brazil, the director of Football Viral and formerly of Flamengo soccer team. Now we will hear Semera from Burundi. Semerera from Burundi.
Hello, my name is Fikiri Nzoisenga. I am a human rights activist, community organizer, and gender equality advocate from Burundi. I grew up in a society where violence, gender-based violence, domestic violence, family violence, were so common that they were considered as the normal way to treat women and girls. And unfortunately, this is still the case until today. However, unlike many men in my community and those from my generation, I do believe in gender equality. I do believe that women have the right to be treated equally and with dignity. And this is something that many people around me, many people in my community don't understand. How a man like me, how did a man like me in a patriarchal country like Burundi chose to be a gender equality advocate? In truth, I can say that the early education I received from my parents contributed a lot to shape, the man I have become today. Because I remember in my family during my childhood, things were so different compared to other families. For example, I've never seen my father fight, quarrel, or insult, in our family. In our household, chores were for everybody, girls and boys, and our parents. Because I remember even my father, he used to join during weekends. He used to join in household chores, and until today he's still hand washing his own clothes. But in other families, household chores were only for girls and their mothers. So I can say that this example of the way my father used to join in household chores, the way he used to respect my stepmother, to support her in every of her daily routines, encouraging her. I think this is something that really influenced me a lot. And here I can even say that my stepmother's example also contributed to this, because she was very strong. She had a very limited education, but she had a small income generating activity that was helping her to contribute to providing for our family. Because I remember when our family was forced to live in a refugee camp in a neighboring country, and my father could not find a job. It's my stepmother's income generating activity that helped us to survive. So I can say that in few words, my parents, they are good example, shaped the man I am today, and it is in their honor that I founded an organization called Youth Coalition Against Gender-Based Violence, which has been working to encourage mobilizing men in my community and around to join in the fight for gender equality. So in few words, I can say that early feminist education by parents is key to raising the next generation of male gender champions, and also to creating a violence-free society for women and girls. And this is something that needs to be taken into consideration by all stakeholders. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And it was refreshing to hear from two very passionate men on this subject. Now I'm going to just highlight a few of the things that were said during the panel, and then turn to the question and answer. Clearly, we have heard that there has been a huge spike in domestic violence during this COVID pandemic. And we've heard wonderful suggestions on how to address this. For example, there's been an emphasis on the need for accurate data and on the need for greater awareness and trained intervention where there is domestic violence. several panelists called for the need for funding and a national agenda on domestic violence, which is clearly lacking in many countries. We heard that the shelters that are there for women, many are not attending. This is complicated by the virus. We also heard that women at home are being left behind. Many have had to leave the workforce and they are suffering as a result. We also heard something which I hadn't heard before. I thought it was very unusual, but very interesting, that there has been a spike in violence against school-age children because they're studying from home on the internet. Those are just a few of the points that have been raised in this very rich panel. I would like now to turn to question and answer. And I would like all the panelists to be prepared to respond. If you want to respond, maybe you could just turn on to unmute yourself, and that I can see that you've unmuted yourself, and you'll know that you're interested to make a response. One of the questions that we received, and it's quite pertinent after hearing these two gentlemen speak, is what role can men play in reducing domestic violence? Would anyone like to address that question? Lopa. Yeah, just raise your hand. That's another way that I know you're interested. Lopa, please.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? Okay, thank you. I think this is an absolutely central point. Society is composed of men and women and people who identify themselves according to different gender preferences. But violence against women and girls, largely speaking, is men's violence against women and girls. And therefore, whether that is individual violence perpetrated by intimate partners or members of the family, or whether that is state violence perpetrated against human rights defenders. The role of men and boys in owning responsibility and in taking leadership alongside women and girls in addressing this is absolutely central. One of the main reasons why we have not seen transformation of patriarchal norms that continue to create excuses for violence. For example, men are at home, they're bored, or that, people, this is a difficult time, it's a complicated time, people are stressed out, so violence is rising. This is, women are not violent. Other women are not perpetrating, women are in as much of a stressful situation and more. They are on the front lines providing care, but they are not perpetrating violence. So we need to understand that the expression of violence, the act of violence against women and girls is an act of power. Men do it because they can. And therefore, the addressing of that fundamental power and men's role in understanding, taking responsibility for, and addressing that is absolutely central. There's been a lot of work that has happened with addressing toxic masculinities, male masculinities, cultures of malehood that promote this kind of aggressive behavior. There's been a lot of work done in that area, and that is really important. However, at this point in time, for system change, it is important to recognize that it's not just about individual masculinities, but we need to address the systems of patriarchal power that continue to promote violence or continue to not take the requisite political and system change measures to address that violence. And let's also recognize but the majority of the leaders in the world are men. Women occupy 1/4 of the leadership positions in this world today. Therefore, ending violence against women and girls, taking the leadership action necessary to end violence against women and girls must come from men.
Thank you very much. And just adding to that, what we heard a few minutes ago is that there are, in many societies, norms are changing that contribute to domestic violence. And there is a huge need for educating everyone on how to raise boys so that they will approach women differently. There is also a question which maybe our panelists from Finland, Riitta, could answer or address, which is what are ways to deal with abusers?
We have a special programs with which we deal and with perpetrators, and I will put on my video, sorry. And we have found that the crucial issue is that the perpetrator understands that how he's behaving is not correct. That's the starting point. We have mutual support groups with which we work with the perpetrators, and also individual long-term work with them. And also, I think it's very important that there's also cooperation with different levels of education in schools to discuss about these issues and to teach young boys already in daycare system that what is right way of dealing with conflicts and what is the right way of treat girls and other persons. So we've started with a new program to work a more systematic way with perpetrators, and I think it's very, very crucial. As previous speaker Lopa was saying, that if we want to make a difference, the crucial thing is to make men understand that they need to play a crucial role to make the difference. That's something which we find very important in my organization and in Finland.
Thank you very much. We also have a question about abuse in same-sex relationships. Would anyone want to address that? Yes.
Thank you, Kristen. I think the question on gender-based violence or same-sex violence in same-sex relationships, I believe it is the way the issue is addressed and looked at. And I also want to touch on males who are victims of domestic violence. We have spoken extensively a lot on women. Proportionately, the numbers, of course, are bigger, but it doesn't discount the fact that men are also victims of domestic violence. And it's not just the toxic masculinity or that sort of culture that pushes them into the corner and for them to suffer in silence, but it's also sometimes it's a social stigma when men go to the police station, when men approach enforcement officers and say, I've been a victim of domestic violence. Many a time they've been told to try to settle it domestically within the walls of your home, but it's different and often different when a female walks into a police station or seeks help. So I think that culture also needs to be perpetuated and enforced, not just by men, but by women as well. As far as gender-based violence is concerned, I always say this, that being in a marriage or being having a marital status as a married person or being in a relationship is not a license or a warrant for you to exert power, authority, or to be a bully. Similarly, in the case of marital rape, if it happens in the street, it is a crime. In Malaysia, it is a crime under the penal code. But if it happens within a marriage or in an institution of marriage, somehow it is your advice to deal with it and your advice to perform your duty as wife or husband, etc. So I think these are the things that we need to look at and expand. And also for more men to speak about these issues. I think we need to support men to speak about and encourage men to speak about domestic violence where women are victims, and also support men where men are victims as well, and to engage and keep the subject alive. I think until and unless we start talking about it, men who suffer from domestic violence, and I think the numbers are also increasing during this pandemic. You know, violence in general has been on an increase. So I think it is apt to also speak about it. Plus, the theme of today's conference is on family violence as well. So family members, including husbands, including fathers, including the elderly, including the disabled, are also victims of domestic violence. And
thank
we
you
need to
so
speak about
much,
it and address.
Kasturi. I'm going to thank you because I want to get to a couple more questions. That was very interesting. We also have a question about what the public and civil society can do to monitor and report on domestic and family violence. Would anyone like to address that? We've heard quite a bit. Yes, Tamar. Tamar.
Hello, thank you. As a CEO of an NGO, I could tell you that I think that the role of the civil society is to be the little child that always say that the king is naked. You know, from the story, to show the government where are the gaps, because usually the civil society organization are on the ground. They meet the people on daily basis. So they should show the governments where are the gaps. They should take care of some of the gaps. And also they should show the government where are the gaps, not only on the private domain, but also on the comprehensive domain. What laws should be created and what regulations should be changed. That's what we do. And there is a very gentle line between working with the government and working against the government, because in some platforms, we are with the government, because in the government, in the welfare ministry of Israel, the one that are sitting there are social workers, all the inspectors and so forth are social workers like I am. So we are thinking the same about the professional answer that should be given to women victims of violence, and on the matter of economic violence and so forth. But in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament, sit the members of the parliament. Some of them have a big social agenda, and some of them are not so much. And again, I'm not talking right or left, okay? You could find the good guys and, and the less good guys in both sides. So we have to protest, and we have to demonstrate, and we have to write angry letters against the phenomena that we locate. So I think it's a very gentle line to go, but it's our real integrity that leads us in the way. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that intervention. We're getting close to the end, but there is another question as to whether financial independence for women makes a difference in the domestic violence situation. Yes, Christine. I'm going to ask Christine because she hasn't had a chance to respond. Christine, the floor is yours.
Yes, it is one of the solutions. If you leave women without economic independence, it's not possible for her to leave the home, to leave her husband. So she needs to be independent financially. I am a former Minister of Status of Women, and I've worked on this situation very hard because it is very, very important, the independence, because this is the way to be able to make choice for her life and the life of their children. So there is a solution in the independence economic. I'm sure of it. Thank you.
Thank you. And a final question, I don't know if who would wish to address this, but we've asked, what role can corporations play in addressing domestic violence? Yes, Dubravka, thank you, please.
Thank you. Maybe to this question, but also some other questions. I think that human rights framework should be applied with respect to all answers that we have heard up to now, because violence against women should be labeled as human rights violation. And we have to look into responsibility of states, of private enterprises, of also private persons with respect to those different forms of gender-based violence against women and girls. And at the end, state responsibility to prevent all those forms of violence against women. But now listening this question about role of men and boys, maybe now it's time really to send CEDAW Convention and Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women to all men at political leaders level, to read those instruments again, to see which responsibilities and commitments their governments accepted by ratifying those instruments, but they are not implemented. So implementation would be the key, and implementation strategies with clear data. Enterprises are also part of the whole system. They do have human rights responsibilities. There is a huge agenda related to businesses and human rights, but unfortunately we are seeing lack of implementation with respect to human rights instruments at all possible levels by all possible stakeholders. So we need to stick to implementation. We need to look into accountability mechanisms. And I think that my mandate and other independent mandates like CEDAW Committee, Working Group on Discriminatory Laws, but also regional mechanisms that are available are also playing important role with respect to support to all those implementation initiatives. So I would like to thank you very much on this panel. And although domestic violence is covering all persons that are victims of domestic violence, focus should be on women because they are predominantly victims of domestic violence. Others should not be excluded, they should be properly included, but we need to see what is coming out from data and what measures are really needed to go into implementation of all those nice instruments that we have adopted. And we have to look into implementation side. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Well, we are exactly on time, and I would like to just thank all the panelists for their excellent interventions and the questioners for their good questions. I would like to end with one of the comments in the Q&A, which says that, which is proposing that we need to change beliefs and mindsets, and saying this may take a long time. But with all of the suggestions we've heard from the panelists, I think we are able to see a light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. So thank you very much for your contributions. And that brings our panel to an end.
May I join again to, even though we are so full of rich information to process, I would like to bring in yet a third patriarch who this time contributed the anthem for the summit. I'm in love with it. I hope you love it as much. Peter Campbell from Australia. wrote and composed for us the anthem for the summit. He called it Waiting Too Long. I hope it moves you as deeply as it moves me.
Yeah. Even before he got the key in the door, she could barely gather the will to keep going. He comes in and everything gets under his skin, and she cares which way the wind is blowing. The shame bruises, everyone loses. Go grab some memories before they're all gone. She waited for a change in the wind, for rain, for angels with miracles and song. She waited too long. Just after the lockdown, COVID crushed their resolve, and all their dreams disappeared with his wages. Alone with a daughter, every lesson taught her a little wisdom for the world that she faces. But they're so shattered and lost. Every line that got crossed fed their fear and their anger and left them alone. Waited for courage, waited for a reason to care when they knew they couldn't keep on. Too long, they waited too long. The moment calls, then it moves on. Hesitating, it's gone. How long is too long is too long. Just when her heart was done with its heaving and her nightmare rolled off her and settled, there was a flicker of hope through the pain in the dark, and she seized it, a fistful of nettle, crept to the cradle, the helpless tangle of sleep took her up, love so tender and strong. She waited for silence, waited for their moment to run. Was she right? Was she wrong? Too long, she waited too long. The moment calls, then it moves on. Hesitating, it's gone. How long is too long is too long. They wouldn't even know he was there at the top of the stairs. All his 4-year-old fears were forbidden. He learned not to weep, just rocked himself off to sleep. Learned what to show them, what to keep hidden. The eyes that see nothing, see everything breaking, See the trampled, see the trapped and torn. He waited for an end to the shaking, for an end to his aching, for the reason why he ever was born. Too long, we waited too long. The moment calls, but then it moves on. Hesitating, it's gone.